I don't know why it all started that way, but I remember that moment for sure. The moment when my heart started beating faster and an emptiness appeared in my head that hadn't been there before. I witnessed them spending the night together. At first it seemed like an accident. Like everything else in my life, it happened gradually, unnoticed, like one small brick that eventually grows into a wall. When I returned home that evening, it was already late. It was night. The woman I loved was sitting in our living room, again with that look on her face that I only saw after a hard day's work when she was trying to find time for herself. But it wasn't just an expression of fatigue, it was something else. It took me a while to realize what it was, but it was no longer our family, no longer my darling. She was sitting on the couch, cross-legged, holding her phone, her eyes so focused on the screen that I couldn't even say hello as usual. We were not a perfect couple. No one would say that about us. She was a careerist, often traveled for work, and I worked from home, so I was alone with the children at night. So it seemed normal to me that we didn't always spend time together. However, there was a noticeable change in her behavior. In her eyes. The way she hid her phone, the way she behaved when I came home. That evening, I tried not to notice that she was too nervous to answer my messages when I asked if she was okay. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe she was tired. But over and over again I caught her not quite answering my questions, trying to change the subject, avoiding my gaze. If it was the first time, I might not have paid attention to it. But this went on for several weeks. And today everything has become different. He was a coach. I didn't know why it annoyed me so much. I didn't mind her exercising and keeping fit myself. The woman I loved often told me about this trainer as a wonderful person. She would laugh when she recalled his joking comments about her physical abilities. But I could feel something inside me change when she started mentioning his training too often. I came home late that night, as usual, and started to prepare dinner. But something was wrong. Her eyes, her hands trembling as she poured the wine. I didn't know why, but my heart was racing. I tried to force myself not to think about it, not to let any suspicions enter my mind, but it came back again and again, like an evil spirit. What if I'm wrong? What if it's just paranoia? Maybe she was just too tired, maybe she really needed more time to herself. But for some reason I couldn't shake it. A feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certain stubbornness in all her words, looks, and even movements. A few days later, I started to pay attention to the details. Now I could see her silent glances when she thought I wasn't looking. Now I noticed how quickly she would hide her phone when I approached her. It made me uncomfortable to even sit next to her in case she was hiding something from me that I wasn't supposed to see. It all started with small signs, the same texts she was hiding when I walked into the room, a change in her behavior when I asked about the coach. She started responding to his messages with a kind of unusual enthusiasm that was previously only characteristic of me. The same trainer that I thought was just part of her healthy lifestyle. I tried to leave all these thoughts behind. But one night, when she went out to dinner with a friend, I couldn't stand it. When I got home, I decided to see what was on her phone. It was not out of idle curiosity, not out of a desire to violate her privacy. I did it because my soul could no longer remain silent. My heart was racing as I felt the cold metal of the phone in my hands. I knew it was the wrong move, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened his password, remembering the day she changed the code. She probably thought I wouldn't be able to guess it. But I did. It was easy. Because her code was our wedding year. The phone opened and I saw the first message from him. His name was in my contact list as Coach, although to be honest, I always thought he wasn't. Requires such specific coding. My heart beat even faster when I started scrolling through their chat history. These weren't the usual sports tips or recommendations for training. Can't you come to me today? I missed you. These words appeared on the screen, and I felt the ground under my feet crack. It was not just a betrayal. It was a hidden, cautious betrayal. It was in the shadows, and I didn't even notice how this shadow grew into something much bigger. I could feel the anger rising inside me, but with it came disappointment, because I already knew she had done it. They had done it. I didn't close the phone right away. I continued to read their messages, each new line painfully striking. Here she writes, "I don't want it to end, but you know I can't leave him." And again, him, "Stay tonight, everything will be fine. I can't wait any longer." Everything in my heart was turning upside down. It was my wife. My Laura. That night, as I lay beside her in bed, I could not sleep. I lay there and waited for her to come back, trying to convince myself that I couldn't be that weak. I cannot and do not have the right to doubt the one I loved. When she came home, I couldn't get a word out. I felt like every step in this game was bringing me closer to the abyss, but I didn't know what to do with this information. I could feel the anger building up inside me. I could have told her everything. I could have confronted her with the fact. But I decided that this moment required restraint. I was preparing my plan. And I was not ready to give up so easily. The next morning Laura was different. She was even more distant, but she tried to pretend that everything was normal. She tried to talk about normal everyday things, like shopping, childcare, and how hard it was for her to balance her career and family. It all sounded normal. But I could feel that something much worse was hiding behind her words. I sat down to breakfast, trying not to look at her, although I couldn't look away. She didn't notice how I studied her every move. How I watched her reaction to my every gesture, how her lips immediately reached for the cup when I asked her if she was okay. I knew she wasn't telling me the truth. I began to feel an invisible pressure building up inside me. It was not just a betrayal. It was death for what I once wanted, for what we had together. We're creating. I thought about our first meetings, how we laughed, how we made plans for the future, how I was ready to help her out of any problem she had. But now I looked at her and couldn't figure out who this woman was next to me. I gathered my thoughts and went to work, although all I could think about were her words, her movements, the way she behaved when I entered the room. I was tormented by the thought, what should I say to her? Should I ask her directly? Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was all in my head. A scene played in my head. I take her hand and look her straight in the eye. "Laura, I know. I know what you did. I know that you and he are together." And at that moment I felt an internal explosion. But what if she just refuses to do it? What if she let me go and said it was just a misunderstanding? What if I stayed alone and she found someone else? My pride didn't allow me to do that. And even though I didn't know how to tell her, I clearly realized that my feelings were no longer important. I began to gather information about this coach. His name was simple, Dan. I found his number in Laura's phone. She wrote it down so often in her contacts that it seemed as if he was already part of our family. A professional, I used to think. The training specialist she had been seeing for months. I knew his pictures, an athletic man, with an expression. Confidence in my eyes. He must have been a good coach. But now, every time I thought of him, my thoughts turned to desperate hatred. I decided to take my time. No, I will not call her out on the spot. I will not make a mistake and confront her with the fact when I am not ready for the consequences. I need to learn more. I need to see everything, down to the last frame, like in a movie where every movement counts. That evening I watched her reactions with special attention. She was trying to be normal again. As usual, she cooked dinner, put it on the table, and talked about work again. But I could see that her eyes did not stay on me. She was always fixing her hair, as if she was subconsciously trying to hide some kind of weakness. I decided that tomorrow, when she left for training, I would follow. How to do it without her noticing. How to avoid attracting attention and learn more at the same time. The answer was obvious. I would watch from the sidelines. I don't know why, but I felt it would be best. I have to learn more about them before I do anything. The next morning I woke up early, much earlier than usual. Laura was still asleep, and I decided it was the perfect moment to learn her rhythm. It was my first attempt to understand what was going on. I had no proof, but I could feel something powerful stirring inside me, as the old walls of patience and trust began to crumble under the onslaught of suspicion. I looked at the clock. It was 7:30. She often gets up no later than 8 to be on time for her training. But for some reason, today her phone was on the nightstand next to her, and it caught my attention. Don't think I was shocked when I saw that she hadn't turned off her notifications. I just remembered how she used to always hide her phone carefully, as if it were her little fortress. But today it was lying open. And just then, the name Dan appeared on the screen. My heart caught in my throat, and I couldn't look away. It happened quickly. I couldn't even explain how my hands started shaking, but I couldn't stop. I read the new messages, and this moment remained in my head like a print. Are you ready today? I don't want to wait any longer. And then, a few minutes later, your car is here, I'm waiting. These simple phrases lit a fire in me that I had never felt before. Laura woke up a few minutes later. She smiled when she saw me in the kitchen and immediately started making coffee as usual. As if nothing had happened. As if nothing had changed. Her eyes did not meet mine. She avoided my gaze, which only added to my suspicions. I tried to stay calm, to pretend that everything was fine. We even started talking about how we were going to spend the weekend, about our upcoming travels, as usual. But all I could think of was the same thoughts. Why didn't I do it sooner? Why didn't I recognize it right away? A few hours later, I found out that she was going to see him again today. It wasn't hard for her to hide it, she just said she was going to practice, as usual. She didn't even suspect that I already knew. I didn't need any more proof. I was ready. While she was getting ready, I packed my things, but did not go to work. I felt that this moment was important. I had to see if everything I suspected was true. And so, I started planning. I decided to just follow her, without talking too much. I got behind the wheel and followed her car, trying not to attract attention, to stay calm, even though I was ready to explode inside. My mind was filled with questions, and every kilometer I traveled seemed to take me even further away from who I was before. I had become a completely different person. She stopped at the gym, but instead of entering it, I saw her looking around as if she was looking for someone. And then he appeared. Dan. Tall, with a subtle smile on his face, he walked up to her car. They didn't exchange many words, but I could see him carefully opening the door to get in. My Laura smiled at him as he kissed her on the cheek. This kiss, which I will never forget, did not look like a friendly kiss at all. It was an intimacy that I could not and did not want to accept. And that's when I realized, this is just a coach. It was something more. My soul was torn, but I didn't give myself the right to show it. They left together, and I decided that I would not follow them. Not today. I had already seen everything I needed to see. I returned home, but I no longer had the feeling I had before. Now my heart was empty and I could no longer look at her the way I used to. All these years I had lived with her, and I had no idea that she was capable of such a thing. And now I could not look at her face calmly, because there, in the depths, I saw a completely different person. The one I was afraid to see. I returned home, but I couldn't find the strength to look her in the eye right away. Laura was there as if nothing had happened. She even smiled when I walked into the kitchen, as if we had just had a trivial fight. I felt everything inside me shrink. She didn't even know that I had seen her with him. She didn't even realize that I already knew. And that made her look even more fake. "Hello, darling," she said, spreading napkins on the table. Just ordinary kindness, ordinary care. It was so strange, so out of place. I tried to look calm. Otherwise, she would have understood everything. No one would believe my innocence if I looked like something had happened. My problem was not to pretend that nothing had happened, but to hide what was going on inside me. "Are you training well?" I asked her, even though I knew that this question would sound like to someone else. But I needed to see her reaction, to see how she would respond. Then she was surprised, but immediately smiled. "Yes, everything is as usual. The training is great. Dan is a real professional. He knows how to motivate me." Dan, I repeated the name. It was too much for me. It was the first time I had ever said this name, heard it from my own lips. And then I saw that she was not ashamed, did not blush. She just looked at me with a slight surprise, and I realized that her confidence was impressive. I could not hold on any longer. I left the room without saying another word. The footsteps on the floor seemed too loud to me. How could I have been so blind until now? How could I not see what was happening in my house? All those months of her behavior, her silence, all those moments when I felt she was trying to run away from me, were actually clear signals. She didn't just change her habits. She changed her essence. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Now I knew. And I was ready to act. I started thinking about how to get more evidence. I realized that I could just. It would be pointless to talk to her now. She will refuse, deny it. If she were honest, it would no longer be a betrayal. So I decided that I would act cunningly. I will not show my cards. I will keep it a secret until I find something more convincing. The next day I decided to see what Laura was leaving behind. I knew she was hiding some things. So I decided to go to her desk in her office. To dig through the papers. I didn't know what to expect, but I had to be prepared for anything. I felt that there might be even more evidence. I found what I was looking for. Here he is, in black and white. She wrote down his phone number on a piece of paper. This was not just a correspondence. It was a concrete agreement, something significant that concerned their time together. How could I not have noticed this before? I held that piece of paper in my hands and I was overcome with anger. She hadn't just been with him. She was with him and thought I wouldn't notice. My hand clutched the paper, and I began to realize that I could no longer stay in the shadows. I couldn't be naive again. I was gripped by the dark energy of revenge that I had been trying to contain all this time. But now, I was ready. My plan was already was born in my head. I remembered how she often told me that she didn't want to change anything in our life. And I knew it was a lie. She had already changed everything. Now it was up to me to change it. I sat in the darkness, holding that piece of paper in my hands, and felt my heart fill with anger. My hand was clutching my phone, on which I had been typing over and over again. I looked through all their messages. Each line was like a stab in the heart, and the thought that I still had no evidence to tell her the truth was no longer so important. All my thoughts were raging like a storm, but one remained clear. She has to pay. Every thought of her, of their meetings, filled me with a fog of hatred. But I was calm. In fact, I was extremely calm. My behavior could have been unbelievable for her. It was like I was in the shadows, and she didn't know that I already knew. It gave me strength. I started to act. First, I decided to see how far I could go without arousing suspicion. How does she respond to my questions about Danny? How can I find out more without revealing my true intentions? That evening I decided to do something that had seemed completely inappropriate to me before. I started asking questions. Slowly, naturally. "Did you see Dan today?" I asked, sitting with her in the kitchen at dinner. I watched her eyes almost imperceptibly look away, as she sucked in air through her nose. It was no longer a simple reaction. It was something more. Yes, of course, it was a training day. "Sorry I'm late," she replied, trying to look relaxed, but her hands were shaking as she picked up her fork. I tried not to look surprised. I pretended that it was all normal, but I couldn't contain the thoughts that were torturing me inside. How could she talk about it so calmly? She didn't even notice how I was looking at her, at her hands, at her. I could not help but look at her. She didn't notice that I already knew for sure that her words were just an attempt to hide something much bigger. "Interesting," I said, and leaned back in my chair. "Have you thought about doing something with Dan outside of training?" It was unexpected for her. She stumbled, and I saw her face tremble for a few milliseconds. It was a moment of weakness that I couldn't help but notice. And then she answered, trying not to look too interested in the conversation. "You know, I don't do anything with him except sports. We only talk about training." In her voice, I heard an attempt to convince herself, not me. She knew she couldn't give a clear answer, because she herself had long since gone beyond professional help. I didn't answer her right away. I just watched her. My eyes were burning her, even if she didn't notice it. I didn't need any more proof. I knew that everything she was saying was just an excuse. She was hiding the truth. But what now? What should I do with this information? I couldn't just come to her and say, "I know everything, Laura. I saw you with him." That would have been too easy, and I realized that this would not bring the desired result. She would give up, turn it into a joke, and I would be trapped. I needed a plan. A plan that would lead her to an answer. The next morning, when I saw her in the car again, I decided to stop by this gym. Just to have a look. I knew she was planning another session with him. And although I wasn't sure I would see more than just a workout there, I wanted to do. I could not afford to be so blind again. My heart was full of anger, but this time I remained cool. I did not allow myself to believe in what I would see. I didn't think about what would happen after I saw them together. The only thing to do was to watch. I parked a few streets away from the gym, so as not to attract attention. It was cautious. This was my next step. And this time I was ready to see them. I was sitting in my car, parked a few streets away from the gym, looking at the entrance. It was quiet. No fuss. Just the way it should be. I knew this would be my last. The day of observation, my last chance to get everything I needed to solidify what I already felt deep down. Laura did not know that I was following her. She still believes that I'm at work, that I stayed home with the kids. She doesn't even realize that I already know more than she thinks. She is prepared. But so am I. And now I was ready to put all the pieces together. I got out of the car, hiding my eyes under my dark glasses, and even though it seemed like nothing could stop me, my heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. All these weeks I have been trying not to show my pain. But today was different. Today I had to take the last step. I cautiously walked to the back entrance of the gym, where I knew Laura and Dan would probably show up in a few minutes. I stood there, as if I were one of the people they might not notice. Among the strange faces in the crowd, I was just another one. And yet, at that moment, I didn't feel like I was the same person I used to be. I was no longer the man who gave everything for his family. I was a shadow. They were not supposed to know what I knew. My hands were shaking, but I remained calm. I took out my phone and started recording. The time for this had come. I couldn't leave the place without proof. And as soon as I did, I saw her. She was walking out the door of the gym, and he was right next to her. He was smiling as he looked at her. She was laughing. It was the laugh I used to think was mine. The one I used to summon. I couldn't take it anymore. My patience was over. I waited a few more seconds to get a good shot of them. And then, when they almost reached their car, I decided to approach them. I stepped out of the shadows and took a few steps forward. My legs felt heavy, but I knew I couldn't stop. The moment I approached them, they noticed me. Laura recognized me immediately, and her face changed, became different. Something almost fatal appeared in her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was cold. I could see that she was scared, but she was also trying to stay calm. She even smiled, but it looked like a defense mechanism. "I just came by to see how you were training," I replied calmly, but these words were only the beginning. "Training? That's none of your business," she said, turning immediately to Dan. He was standing next to us, silently watching us. But I could feel my heart shrinking. Now I could see it. He was with her. And I was here to show her that I was no longer the man I once was. "Dan, you can go." "I'll talk to her," I told him, and to my surprise, he didn't object. He just nodded, turned and walked away, leaving us alone. I realized that he wasn't afraid of me. They had all along believed that I knew nothing. They thought I was just a guy who was sitting at home and didn't suspect anything. Laura looked at me in disbelief. "What do you want, Tom? Are you following me?" Her voice sounded like she was about to explode. In her eyes, I saw something more than just denial. I saw fear. "You know that this is unstoppable, Laura," I said calmly, but these words were like a sentence. I was ready to act. "What do you want?" she exclaimed, and I realized that she had already guessed what I knew. She started to get nervous, trying to hide her panic. "I want you to tell the truth," I replied, and her face lost all signs of confidence. She knew now that I knew everything. And I was ready to find out why she did it. I stood in front of her, feeling all my emotions turn into cold stubbornness. Laura stepped back, her eyes filled with fear and surprise, but she was still trying to hold herself together. I could see it, as well as the way her gaze was trying to find a way to justify herself. She knew I knew, but she wasn't ready for it yet. "Do you want to know the truth?" I asked when she opened her mouth again, but no words came out. I did not let her speak. I was ready to know everything. Now I had her. "I'm asking you, Laura. What were you doing with him? How could you betray me?" I couldn't contain my anger, although I was still trying to keep control. I didn't know how but now that these words have been spoken, everything has immediately fallen into place. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, trying to find the strength to answer. And when she opened them again, I saw her lips holding back, as if she was trying to avoid the truth. But I had already seen her real face. "Tom, Her voice sounded soft, almost without strength. And I realized that she was trying to figure out where to start her lie, because what she was about to say couldn't be true. "Don't lie." I realized I couldn't take it anymore. I approached her, but she stepped back, as if I were a stranger to her. "I saw you with him. I know what's going on." She froze for a moment, as if she had fully realized that she had lost control of the situation. Her gaze became soft, as if she was trying to find something in my eyes, something that would allow her to escape the answer again. "Tom, I didn't know how to tell you." Her words were not as confident as before. It was the moment when she finally realized that I had her hooked. She was no longer at her best. I just couldn't live with this routine anymore. "You're always working. You're always immersed in work," and I felt so lonely. I stood there without saying anything. There was something true in her words, but they could not justify what she had done. She chose him when I tried to be there for her. She chose him even when she knew that I would still be there for her. And now that everything was out in the open, she tried to justify her actions by using loneliness. You couldn't find another way to talk to me? You couldn't find another way to resolve this? You chose him over me? I asked, trying not to shout, but my words broke through the cold exterior. She stood in front of me, her hands clenched into fists, trying to find something to explain it all. But her eyes, like mine, were already broken. She realized that she could not take anything back now. He and I didn't do anything like that, she said again, trying to put more confidence in her voice. I couldn't stay with you again like before. Don't you understand what it's like to live with someone who never pays attention to you? I didn't want to follow him. I just wanted to feel like I was still alive. I listened to her, and my heart began to break. It was incredibly painful, but I had no right to give her an easy way out. It could not be just an attempt to justify myself. It was something more. I felt my patience was running out. But I would not give her the pleasure of seeing me cry. No, I couldn't afford to cry in front of her. I stayed cold because that was the only way I could get to the end of this. You chose him. And now I have a choice, I said, my voice barely concealing my anger. I have a choice to forgive you or to leave it at that. And I think you already know what my choice will be. She stood in front of me, looking at me silently. And in her eyes I saw something I could not bear. It was not just guilt. It was defeat. And I realized that even if she wanted to resume our relationship, it would never be the same. I looked at Laura, and even though her eyes were full of tears, I couldn't sympathize. It was not easy. My soul was desperate to free itself from this storm that was raging inside me, and every word she said tore me apart, but at the same time gave me strength. She stood before me, silently, with her head held high, trying to hide her guilt under the guise of determination. And I could see how she was losing herself, trying to maintain at least some honor in my eyes. Tom, I know I made a mistake. I can't justify what I did, but I can promise you that it won't happen again. Her voice was shaking, but she still tried to sound confident. I didn't answer right away. I remained silent, feeling my patience melting away, feeling every moment we spent on empty explanations getting worse. I knew that she was trying to bring everything back, but my inner walls had already been destroyed, and now they could not be built again. All her words were just an echo of something that could not be brought back. Do you really think I can believe that? I answered her coldly, not looking her in the eye. You want me to forgive you, but why should I? You chose him, Laura. You chose to leave me. And now that I know everything you did, you want me to come back to you? A small shadow of disappointment flashed in her eyes, but she did not lower her head. She tried to be strong, even when she saw me looking at her, not with understanding, but with indifference that destroyed everything she wanted. Tom, I don't know how to explain this, but I don't want to lose you. It was a mistake, a big mistake. I'm afraid of losing you. She took a step toward me, but I stepped back. Don't try, I said, holding her gaze, you've already lost me. You have no right to my forgiveness. You chose another path for yourself long ago, and now that path is your destiny. She froze in place, her eyes filled not only with tears, but also with a sense of deep regret. But now it didn't matter anymore. I could no longer be the kind of man who simply forgives without understanding whether it is worth it. I had already made my choice. Tom. She began, but I interrupted her, becoming even more determined. You have to understand, Laura. This is not about your feelings. It's not about mine. This is about your betrayal. And now you have to live with it. Know that I cannot forgive what you did. I felt like everything I had built up over the years was destroyed by her choice. And every word she said only confirmed that she was incapable of feeling the depth of what she had lost. Although I felt pain, it was not the same as before. It was anger that flooded me, forcing me to find a way to end this story. There was confusion in her eyes, she couldn't understand why I wouldn't give her a chance. But I was confident in my determination. It was not just a betrayal. It was her complete rejection of me. We stood in silence. I was ready to leave her, to leave this house that had long since become a stranger. And although I felt my anger squeezing my heart, I couldn't stop myself. Tom. Her voice was almost a whisper now. But I didn't have the strength to listen to her anymore. I turned and walked away, leaving her there with tears in her eyes and a broken heart. It was the last thing I did for her. I left her in her own world of lies. And I didn't regret it. I just kept walking, not looking back. For the next few days, I kept my distance from Laura, trying not to look her in the eye, because I knew I couldn't hold all that anger inside me. I stayed in the room when she came in and never tried to talk to her. Time went by, and with each new day, her eyes became more and more filled with pressure. She didn't have the strength to keep up this game, and I could see it. But I was not ready to accept her apology, even if it was from the heart. I wasn't ready to understand her, because I couldn't. Every time I tried to go back to those memories, to the time when we laughed together, when we made plans for the future, I could only see her face when she was with him. It could not be erased. One of those evenings, when she came home late, I sat in the living room, watching her movements, her attempts not to meet my eyes. I didn't know why I stayed here, why I couldn't just leave. Perhaps because I couldn't leave it like that. I had to do this. For myself. Tom, we need to talk, her voice was filled with anxiety. She stood by the door, trying to look as if nothing had happened. I didn't say anything, and she realized that she had to continue on her own. She sat down on the couch opposite me, clutching her arms to her chest. I know what I did wrong. But please, you can't just leave it like that. She said, looking at me as if expecting me to say at least a few words that would give her hope. But I had no more room for hope. I had only one goal, to put an end to this situation, to close this page, to close it. Laura, I said her name with cold detachment, as if it were a foreign sound. I can't be with you anymore. You betrayed me, and it doesn't matter how many times you apologize, how many times you cry. You have already chosen your path, and I will not be a part of it. In her eyes, I saw the moment when she realized that she could not change anything else. It was like a last-ditch effort to keep from falling, but she knew she couldn't get up. I love you, Tom, she said quietly, her words sounding almost like a plea, like a last hope that I would return. I could feel myself breathing heavily, but I knew that this was the last moment when I could change everything. I was standing on the edge between the past and the future. She couldn't come back, and neither could I. I couldn't let myself become the person I was before. I was another person. And I had no room for this love anymore. You've already made up your mind, Laura. And so have I. We can't be together anymore. I said it with such coldness that I wasn't even surprised at how easy it was. She did not answer. She sat silently, her eyes losing clarity. I stood up without waiting for an answer and started walking to the door. Each step made me feel like I was taking away everything that had once been ours. It was a step I could not avoid. You have to realize, Laura, that you can't take it back. You have chosen your path. And I'm choosing mine. I turned around in the doorway and saw her sitting there, silent, without strength and without protection. And that was the last thing I saw in our life together. I walked out and never looked back. I had plans for my life, and they no longer included her. I left Laura behind, but I did not feel liberated. My heart was not at peace. It seems that even when I stopped looking at her face, her Her presence remained with me in every step, in every breath. All these days, all these nights without her did not bring a sense of relief. I was torn by the struggle. Did I do the right thing, or was it all just a flash of emotion that I couldn't control? I tried to return to my normal life, but nothing worked. My hand shook when I checked my messages, and every call from my colleagues brought me only emptiness. All my thoughts were there, in that house that now seemed alien. It was as if I had returned to an empty space in which there was no longer any room for love, trust, or even familiar conversations. One morning, when I woke up from a heavy sleep, my mind was still spinning with what was left over from the recent conversations. I could feel the pressure coming from Laura, even though she was no longer around. I couldn't get rid of this thought. I never found out what really caused her to cheat on me. Was it just a matter of physical attraction, or did she really feel a void that she couldn't fill in our marriage? I got ready and decided to visit the place that used to be our home. Before I got behind the wheel, I checked my phone and suddenly saw a new message from her. She couldn't leave me alone, and I could already feel that her words were not sincere. Laura, Tom, I want us to talk. I know it's complicated, but I can't live with what we've lost anymore. I am sincerely sorry. This is hard for me, and I want to come back to you. You know how much I love you. Maybe we should start over. I promise it won't happen again. I smiled bitterly, feeling something inside me start to ache. It wasn't because I felt sorry for her, but because her words seemed so empty, so meaningless. She didn't realize that I didn't want her to apologize or forgiveness. She had already lost everything. But I didn't answer right away. I did not allow myself to fall into that trap again now. My answer was already written in my head. I knew what I had decided. I decided it was over. So I just sent her a message that no longer needed explanation. You've already made your decision, Laura. And so have I. Everything that was between us is now in the past. I can't be with you anymore. And your words can't change what you've done. I could feel my heart clenching again with pain, but it was not the same as before. It was more than just a betrayal. It was the final realization that my marriage was over. I couldn't love her anymore, and I couldn't stay in this relationship anymore. She was not who I thought she was. And everything I did was not out of weakness, but out of determination. I went to her house. Each step brought me closer to the moment when I could finally say it. I didn't want to have any more connections with her world. It was a moment of purification for me. I did not return to my old life. I was ready to say the last word. When I reached the door, I heard her voice coming from behind the door. Tom, I know you're coming. I know you want to give us another chance. But I had already been. I am confident in my decision. I just knocked. And when she opened the door, I said, "It's over. We can't be together anymore." I stood in front of her, her face looking the same as it did a few days ago when she stood on the same doorstep, trying to convince me to leave everything behind. But this time I was different. There was no pain in my eyes. The pain was there, in my chest, but now it had no power. It did not stop me, did not force me to stay. I was ready to go. I was no longer the man who had been with her. Tom, please, don't. I know I did everything wrong, but you know how much I love you. Maybe we should try again. Her words were truly touching, but I didn't feel any weakness in myself. I looked at her, and those words seemed so far away, as if they belonged to another person. I knew she was repentant, that her heart wanted to take it all back, but it didn't matter anymore. I couldn't go back to what had happened before. That path was closed, and I had no intention of looking for new opportunities for old mistakes. I can't do it anymore, Laura, I said, and these words, though they sounded soft, were resolute. They were no longer just a phrase, they became part of reality. You were with him. You made your choice, and now we both have to live with the consequences. She took a step back, her eyes were full of tears, but I couldn't let myself give up. I couldn't let myself forget everything that had happened between us. Everything that had happened up to that point felt so foreign. And now, when she was trying to come back to me, I could only feel emptiness. Do you really want to do this? Her voice was trembling, she was trying to find some weakness in me. But her words had no power anymore. Tom, we built everything together. We've been through so much, you can't just walk away. But I was firm in my decision. We built it, Laura, but you destroyed it. And I can't forget what you did. These words that came out of my mouth were not malicious, but they were more determined than ever. I no longer wanted to be part of this story that ended in betrayal. She closed her eyes and silently walked away, as if she knew that this moment could not be returned. I was not stopped by her grief. I was not stopped by her tears. I was no longer her husband. I was the one who had to go on, despite the pain. I took the last step, I walked out the door. I could feel my body filled with emptiness, but also with relief. I did not go back, although every step was harder than ever before. I was no longer hers. And I realized that even if she was crying now, I would no longer be the man to whom she could forgive everything. And it wasn't painful. It was liberating. When I left the house, I saw fog around me. It was not gray or black. It was just empty. And in it I could feel everything starting to turn. I was walking forward, and there was nothing that could stop me. I returned to my car, and it was no longer the same car that brought me here a few years ago. This was my path. I would no longer look for answers in the past. Everything was on a new level now. And although I didn't know what would happen next, I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't her choice. I was mine. I left. And I never looked back. Driving through the familiar streets, I felt the tension in my body gradually disappear, but it was replaced by emptiness. An emptiness that could not be filled with any words or emotions. It was a new reality, a new world, in which I was alone. And although I had no desire to return to the past, I felt that this period of my life left a big void that I didn't even know how to fill. We often imagine that after a breakup, everything will somehow get back to normal, that we will start to recover. But I didn't feel any recovery. It was not freedom, but catharsis. That moment when you stop being a part of something, but it doesn't give you joy, only bitterness about what you've lost. I realized that now I had to fight not only with the past, but also with myself. After everything I had been through, I was not ready for what I was feeling. I could not be calm. I couldn't forget Laura, but I knew for sure that I didn't want her back. I could no longer be her husband. She had chosen a different path, and I could no longer follow her. A few days have passed since I finally left her. I tried to immerse myself in my work, but it didn't bring any relief. Every clip with her images appeared in my head, but I had no intention of returning to these memories. It was all in the past, and I kept telling myself that it didn't matter. She had already made her choice. And I had to go on. One evening I decided to go for a walk, just to give myself time to think. The city looked so familiar, but the distance between us, between my past and my present, seemed endless. I looked at the people walking by. I looked at the people around me, at their faces, at the way they laughed and talked. And I realized that this was not my life. My life was different now. I couldn't be a part of this world until I decided who I was going to be next. I walked a few more blocks and stopped at the old park where Laura and I used to walk together. There, among the trees, I heard her voice in my head. But it wasn't the voice I wanted to hear. It was just an echo of what we had lost. Something that can never be returned. At that moment, I realized that I no longer wanted to be a prisoner of these memories. All those past relationships, all that we had experienced, no longer had the power to hold me. I decided that I would find my own way, and I would not let the past determine my future. That park became a kind of boundary for me. The moment when I finally stood on a new path. It wasn't a moment where I felt completely liberated, but I felt like I was letting go of everything that was holding me back. Laura was a part of that past, but it didn't have to be a part of me anymore. On the way home, I felt cold air filling my lungs. It was not just a feeling of cleansing. It was a feeling of a new beginning, albeit a difficult one. I was no longer the same person I was before. I was a changed man. And although I didn't know what my life would look like now, I was ready to find out. And although it was hard, although my heart never stopped hurting, I was sure that I had made the right choice. A month after I left Laura, I realized one important thing: no breakup gives you immediate peace of mind. At first, you think it will be over instantly, that when you stop seeing the person you spent so much time with, you'll feel like it's easy. But in reality, this process is not linear. There are days when you feel strong, and there are others when you want to take it all back and start all over again. Nothing could restore my confidence. Every time I woke up in the morning, the feeling of emptiness would not let go. The streets that I used to drive down with Laura now seemed like strangers. Her absence from my life left a heavy mark, and I felt like month after month was stretching out in time, but the pain was not going away. I tried to forget. I tried to move forward. But sometimes I would wake up at night, and the feeling of what it was all about was so strong that I couldn't breathe. My work was the only thing that helped me keep going. I plunged into projects and started new businesses. But even when I threw off the wave of tasks, I felt that something was missing. I was no longer the man who calmly accepted his role in life. I was the one who put myself first, who stopped living for others. But even this did not give me complete peace. I started thinking about the future a lot. What now? What will happen next? My idea of happiness changed. I no longer sought comfort in the past, and I realized that I needed to start building my life from a new foundation. One evening, when I was returning from another meeting, I felt myself being drawn to a place where we used to frequent, a cafe where Laura and I used to spend hours talking about plans for the future. And although I was ready to leave this place in the past, something inside me made me come back here. It was a feeling of a vicious circle that needed to be closed. I didn't intend to meet Laura again, but I wanted to regain at least some of what I had lost. I sat down at a table and ordered black coffee, the same kind we used to drink together. It was one of those places where you don't seem to change. All this time, when I looked at the cup in front of me again, I felt like a different person. My heart was no longer beating the way it used to. I was someone else, stronger, with a greater awareness of what was happening. But I was no longer a prisoner of the past. Perhaps that was the moment when I realized that, despite everything, I had to move forward. I couldn't afford to hold on to my memories. They were hard, they hurt, but I was no longer the one who was hiding in them. I was a man who was looking for a way out of this maze. I was ready to start over. Laura and I had a lot of plans for the future, and I felt like it was weighing me down. Now I was thinking about my future, and it wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. And I realized that even if I don't know where I'm going, I know for sure that it will be mine. Decision, not hers. At that moment, I began to notice how my emotions were changing. I no longer wanted to take things back, and although her tears and words remained in my memory, I did not let them define who I was. I began to see new possibilities for myself, even if they were not yet fully understood. Now I was ready to live for myself. I could not be the kind of man who waits for someone else to change his life. I became a man who had to create his own life. Time went on, and although I tried to move forward, I realized that finally accepting the breakup was harder than I had imagined. For the first weeks after I left Laura, I heard her voice in my head, even when I tried not to think about it. She was in everything, in my habits, in the places we went together, in the little things that once seemed insignificant. And although I tried to dismiss these memories, they would not let me go. But now, after all this time, I realized that I am no longer trying to forget her. I realized that you can't just throw away all the moments in your life, even if they brought pain. They were part of me, part of who I became. They shaped me and taught me. I didn't know if I would ever have a new love, or if I would ever be able to trust again, but I knew one thing: I was no longer dependent on Laura. I stopped waiting for her calls, I stopped thinking about what she might say or do. She was a part of the past, and I could see it clearly now. I started paying more attention to myself. Work was no longer my only salvation. I began to resume old habits that once brought me joy: walking, sports, spending time with friends. At first it was not easy. I felt an emptiness, but now I knew that this emptiness was not death, but a new space. I could create new things. One evening I was sitting in a cafe, drinking coffee and just watching people. I noticed how easily they laughed, how casually they talked, and I realized that I wanted to do the same, not to be in a constant struggle with the past, not to keep this heavy baggage I was carrying in my head. I didn't want to let Laura or anyone else define my emotions or decisions anymore. I left the cafe and felt the air was different, fresh and alive. This step, though small, was a big one for me. I returned home feeling confident and centered. My heart was no longer full of pain, and although I still felt bitter from time to time, I no longer let it control my life. A few days later, I went on a short trip to recover myself completely. It was my moment alone, a time when I could be with my thoughts. I realized that I was no longer bound to the past. It was hard, but I felt like I was starting to build my new life. I wasn't going to look for recovery in what had already happened. I was creating my new self, even if I didn't know what it would be like. When I returned home, I felt ready for change again. I was no longer a man who was just waiting for things to go back to the way they were. I was someone who was able to leave everything behind, who was able to overcome the pain and accept that life goes on, even when something or someone is no longer with us. Laura was a part of my past, and I was no longer letting her determine my future. All those months of pain and doubt led me to this moment when I realized that freedom is not the absence of problems. It is the ability to move on, even when you feel like you have no more strength. And now, standing on the threshold of a new life, I realized that it was my decision. It was my choice to move on, and it was the best thing I could do for myself. I was no longer waiting for things to come back. I was creating my future. And although I didn't know what it would bring, I was ready to welcome it with open arms. More time has passed than I could have imagined when I first left Laura. And now, looking back on everything that happened, I couldn't help but feel how much I had changed. It was not just a change of habits or a choice of new paths. It was a transformation. I became someone else, and even if I sometimes felt sad or longed for the days we were together, I realized that it was necessary for my own growth. I was sitting on the shore of the lake, looking at the calm surface of the water, and I felt myself letting go of the past more and more with every breath. It no longer defined me. I saw my reflection in the water, but not the man I was then, wounded and filled with hatred. It was a man who was now accepting the past, but I no longer held on to it. I saw a man who could now move forward. I was no longer tormented by the thought that I had lost everything. I hadn't lost anything that could have made me stronger. And even if a part of me still felt pain, I now knew that this was just another stage of my life that I had forced myself to go through. I didn't. I was ready to forget Laura, but I was also ready to forget all the hopes I had for her. I felt how important this moment was for me. I still didn't know where life was taking me, but I knew that I was now moving in the right direction. It was not just a recovery. It was a rebirth. A few weeks later, I met old friends again whom I hadn't seen since my world began to fall apart. They looked at me with distrust and even surprise. It was the same old group, but I no longer felt like a part of that world. I wasn't the kind of man who would go back, seeking solace in old acquaintances. I already had a different goal. I had started a new phase, and even if it wasn't a full start yet, I knew what I had to do. What happened between Laura and me was no longer my weakness. It was my challenge and my victory. I no longer relied on another person to define my place in this world. I realized that this world is not her, not us. It was me. And I was creating my own story. No one had more power over my inner world. And so, when I looked at the lake again, I felt every last bit of pain disappear. My new reality was not bright or loud. It was a quiet freedom from those who betrayed me and from myself when I could not forgive. I returned home that night, feeling like my heart was no longer heavy as a rock. Although I had not yet found what I was looking for, I knew one thing: would not stop. I would keep going. And now this was my path. My choice. I could have made a mistake. But I wasn't afraid, because this was my life. I didn't watch the memories anymore, I didn't wait for them. They remained there, at the very bottom of my soul, and I no longer tried to retrieve them. I was not someone who waited to return to the past. I was someone who moved forward. And I already knew that now I would choose who would go with me.